I was working night shifts at County General last year when this whole thing started. After my shift ended at 7 a.m., I always took the number 47 bus home from the stop near River Plaza Mall. That early in the morning, the place was quiet, except for the occasional jogger or someone unlocking their shop. One day in late February, I got there and noticed a woman standing a little too close to the bus shelter. She was mumbling to herself, her hands making quick, sharp gestures at no one in particular. Her jacket was dirty, the sleeves frayed, and her hair hung in uneven clumps. When a man walked by with a coffee, she stepped toward him and barked something loud enough for me to catch the anger in her tone. He didn't engage, just kept walking, but she stayed facing the street like she was waiting for someone else to cross her path. I kept my distance, standing closer to the corner where I could still see the road. Working in a hospital, you learn to pick up on certain things: rapid speech, unpredictable movement, signs someone might be in crisis. I wasn't going to start a conversation, but I kept her in my peripheral vision in case she suddenly closed the gap between us. The number 47 appeared at the far end of the street, and I noticed the driver slowing as he approached. His eyes flicked from me to her, and then, instead of stopping, he kept rolling, giving me a quick shake of his head through the windshield. The woman shouted after the bus as it passed. I didn't wait around to see if she'd turn her attention to me. I just cut across the parking lot, heading for the next stop 3 blocks down. It was more of a walk, but at least I could wait there without being in the same spot as her. The following week, I finished my shift and walked the same route toward River Plaza. The morning was cold, a thin layer of frost still on the grass, and I could see my breath when I exhaled. As I got closer to the stop, I saw her again. Same jacket, same rough posture, standing in the exact spot as before. This time, she was quiet. She turned her head toward me as I approached, and her expression shifted into a slow, deliberate smile. She didn't move toward me or say anything, just watched me while I kept walking to the other end of the shelter. Something about the way she smiled stuck with me. Not friendly, not even mocking, just fixed on me like she'd been expecting to see me there. I told myself it was nothing, that maybe she smiled at everyone, but when I glanced over again, she was still looking, still smiling, and it didn't stop until I stepped onto the bus. I started taking the earlier run after that. It meant clocking out a little faster and skipping the last cup of coffee in the break room, but I figured if I adjusted my schedule, I wouldn't see her again. That worked for exactly 2 days. On the third morning, I walked toward the earlier bus and saw her standing at the same stop, even though it was almost half an hour before I'd seen her on the other mornings. She wasn't looking around at cars or people this time. She was looking directly at me as soon as I came into view. I boarded without making eye contact, choosing a seat halfway down. As we pulled away, I caught her reflection in the window, head tilted slightly, still watching until the bus turned the corner. When I mentioned it to Sarah during our lunch break, she barely looked up from her salad. "You're probably overthinking it," she said. "A lot of patients or people in crisis hang around that area. They get into routines. It's not about you." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But the timing didn't feel like coincidence anymore. She wasn't just there. She was there when I was. And now, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was starting to plan it that way. She was waiting before dawn the third time, standing under the shelter light like she'd slept there. I meant to walk past to the next stop. She stepped out, closed the distance, and said, "Hello, Jessica. How's your mother doing after her surgery?" I stopped cold. I hadn't told anyone there my name. Mom's procedure wasn't public. I asked how she knew. Then she listed specifics like she was reading my charting history. A gallbladder drain that failed 2 months earlier. The nephew with the red backpack. The unit I floated to on Christmas night. She named bed numbers and timestamps, and the narc waste I signed because pharmacy was backed up. Those weren't street details. Those lived behind login screens. I told her to stay back and said I had to go. She didn't follow. "You always move fast when alarms go off," she said. "Room 416. You called a code at 0312. You were good, but he died anyway." The bus pulled up and I got on. My hands shook so much I missed the fare pad twice. I stopped using that stop. I got rides when I could, took ride shares, walked over the river to catch a different line. For 2 days, I didn't see her. On the third, I went to the coffee shop near my apartment at noon. When I turned from the counter, she was at the back table, elbows on the wood, just watching. I left the coffee sitting and walked out. I changed gyms. I changed grocery stores. I logged out the minute my shift ended. Still, I'd spot her 2 aisles over in produce, reflected in a freezer door, or sitting in the gym lobby like she was waiting for a ride. Each time she said something she shouldn't know. She knew about my breakup with David, my sister's pregnancy, what I'd ordered for lunch. She recited my mailbox number and the sticker on my windshield. No threats, just facts. Hospital security asked if she'd touched me or tried to enter restricted areas. Not yet. They suggested documenting everything and calling police if she trespassed. They gave me a crisis line and a pamphlet. I went home with paper and a knot in my gut. Sleep got thin. I left the TV on because silence turned into footsteps in my head. I kept blinds shut and used the back stairs. When David texted about picking up his last box, I told him to come at noon with a friend. Nobody alone at my door. The break came on a slow Wednesday overnight. I'd been pulled to MedSurg. After midnight, a resident wanted a printed lab list, so I logged in at a hallway terminal. As the list spooled, a name slid past on an old psychiatry consult. Crawford, Linda. It pulled up a discharge I barely remembered. 6 months ago, a woman who wouldn't make eye contact. The same angled mouth I'd been seeing at bus stops and coffee shops. I went into the audit trail for my own chart. There were view events from terminals I never use, at hours I wasn't at work. Late mornings, mid-afternoons. Some were public kiosks. One was a family consult room. Each entry had a badge ID. Temporary. Assigned to support services. It looked like someone parking at quiet screens and opening me again and again. I took printouts to charge. She called compliance. IT showed multiple hits on my employee file tied to a badge marked lost months earlier. Security pulled footage. A woman lingering near public terminals, head down, hands quick. I confirmed the face. They told me not to approach her, to dial their office and then 911 if she came near me off hours. I filed for a protection order the next morning. The clerk helped me write it. Stalking, harassment, unauthorized access to medical info. I stapled screenshots and copies. The judge signed a temporary order by afternoon. Service went to the sheriff. I added a second lock that night. A week was quiet. Then a manila envelope arrived at my door with no return. Inside, a printout of my schedule for the next 2 weeks with days off highlighted. No note. I drove it to the precinct. The officer nodded at the order and said to call immediately if I saw her. She violated it the next Sunday. I was leaving the laundromat with a bag over my shoulder. She stood across the street by the park entrance and gave a small wave like we were neighbors. I crossed away and dialed 911 while I walked. She matched me on the opposite sidewalk, calling out facts like she was still reading a screen. She said my landlord's name and the building's maintenance code. I told the dispatcher there was an active order and I was being followed, gave my location, and kept straight to a busier avenue. 2 patrol cars came. The officers went to her first. She didn't fight. She just turned and stared at me over her shoulder while they cuffed her. At the station, a detective took my statement. In her bag, they found a notebook full of sketches and notes, my outfits by day, Dates I swapped shifts, lists of patients by initials, quick maps of stops and entrances. There were rough passwords and login paths, some wrong, a few close. IT later confirmed she'd used unattended terminals and that a lost badge had never been deactivated like it should have been. The hospital's privacy officer called to apologize without admitting fault. Court moved fast because of the order. She was charged with misdemeanor stalking and state privacy crimes. The hospital added a complaint for unauthorized access to protected health information. I sat on a bench while lawyers drifted by. Sarah sat with me and didn't say much. The prosecutor said I might have to testify. In the end, Linda Crawford took a plea. Supervised probation, mandatory treatment, a no-contact order. The hospital changed things. The lost badge was finally killed. Auto logouts shortened on public machines. Privacy reminders moved from a yearly click box to drills. Security walked the lobby more. I changed too. Camera on my door. Better lockbox for mail. Routines messy on purpose. I said no to nights for a while. I learned the names of neighbors who stay up late and the ones who don't mind a knock. I kept the pamphlet and wrote dates and times on the back until the paper went soft. I think about that first morning, how easy it was to label her as just another crisis and keep my distance. Now when my shift ends, I don't stand at River Plaza. I take the long way to a busier stop. If I don't like the faces, I keep walking to the next one. The only time I use the old stop is if 3 or 4 of us are leaving together, and the glass is clean enough that I can watch the road and the reflection behind me at the same time. When the bus sighs open, I climb aboard, tap once, and keep moving until I feel the doors shut and the city slide by like a current. I hold the pole, watch the glass, and let the engine noise drown it out. Tomorrow, I'll take a different street, a door, and keep moving. When I was a junior at State, I lived in Patterson Hall, one of those old brick dorms with the multi-level parking garage underneath. It was convenient because you could get from your car to the elevator without ever stepping outside, which was great in bad weather. I usually stayed late at my boyfriend's off-campus apartment, sometimes until close to midnight, and by the time I got back, the garage was mostly empty except for a few scattered cars. The lighting down there wasn't great. Long fluorescent tubes that flickered in spots, humming faintly overhead. The air always smelled like oil and damp concrete. One night, I pulled into my usual space on the lower level. As soon as I turned off the engine, I noticed him. A man, maybe mid-40s, standing between 2 of the thick concrete pillars across the aisle. He wasn't leaning or pretending to be on his phone. He was just standing there, facing my direction, hands at his sides. He didn't look like a student, or even faculty. He was too old, too still. His clothes didn't fit the campus vibe either. Dark jacket, loose jeans, boots that looked worn. I kept my movements calm and normal, like nothing was wrong. Locked the car, slung my bag over my shoulder, and started walking toward the elevator lobby. My footsteps echoed off the concrete. I could feel his eyes following me, and every instinct told me he wasn't just down there by chance. I didn't hear a phone buzz, no car door opening, nothing. Just the quiet hum of the lights and my own footsteps. I didn't look back until I was almost to the door, and even then it was just a quick glance. He hadn't moved, still watching. I hit the button for the elevator and stood there, feeling the seconds stretch. When the doors opened, I stepped inside and pressed the button for the main floor. The metal doors slid shut, and I let out the breath I'd been holding. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe he was waiting for someone, but something about the way he was positioned, half in shadow, right between those pillars, made me think he'd been waiting for me specifically. When the elevator opened on the ground floor, I stepped out into the narrow hallway that led toward the sidewalk outside the dorm. The air was cooler out here, the sound of cars from the street in the distance. I walked toward the main entrance, the weight of my bag pulling on my shoulder, still telling myself it was fine. But halfway down the sidewalk, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned my head slightly and saw him. The same man from the garage. He'd come up the stairs instead of taking the elevator, and now he was about 30 feet back, walking in the same direction I was. His stride matched mine exactly. When I sped up, so did he. I scanned ahead. The sidewalk ran along the side of the dorm toward the front steps. About halfway up, I spotted one of those blue emergency call boxes with the big red button under a plastic cover. My hand twitched toward it, but I hesitated. I wasn't completely sure yet. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe he was heading somewhere else. The thought of calling campus security only for him to keep walking past made me feel ridiculous. Still, the sound of his shoes on the concrete was steady, deliberate. I gripped my bag strap tighter and kept walking, eyes fixed on the nearest dorm entrance. It wasn't the main lobby, it was one of the side doors with a keycard reader. But it was closer. My pace quickened. That's when I heard it. His steps picked up too. I didn't think anymore. I broke into a run, my bag bouncing hard against my hip, the sound of his shoes slapping the pavement right behind me. My hand was already in my pocket for my student ID card. The door came into reach. I swiped the card, yanked it open, and slipped inside, letting it slam shut behind me. Through the glass, I saw his face, jaw tight, eyes locked on me. He reached the door and tried the handle, but it was already locked again. His expression twisted into something sharp and angry, and then he turned and jogged away into the darkness beyond the glow of the dorm lights. The next morning, I woke to my phone buzzing non-stop. A campus-wide alert had been sent out. Security was looking for a man matching the exact description of the one I'd seen the night before. They warned students to avoid walking alone after dark and to call immediately if spotted. The grainy still photo attached to the email, taken from a garage security camera, froze my stomach. It was him, standing half in shadow just like when I'd first seen him. Security officers came by my dorm to ask a few questions. I told them everything: the garage, the sidewalk, the chase to the door. They nodded, took notes, and said they'd patrol more heavily in the area. Still, they admitted they hadn't caught him. Without a name or solid leads, they couldn't do much more than keep an eye out. For about a week, I didn't see him. I tried to convince myself he'd moved on, maybe spooked by the increased patrols. I started walking to class again without scanning every shadow. Then, 2 weeks later, it happened. I was leaving the library in the late afternoon, the campus still busy with students. Across the plaza, a man sat on a bench, a newspaper unfolded in his hands. But the angle was wrong. He wasn't reading. He was looking straight over the top edge at me. Our eyes met for less than a second, but it was enough. My chest tightened. I turned away and walked quickly toward the library's side exit, pulling out my phone. I called campus security and reported the sighting, describing his clothes, his position. By the time they got there, he was gone. Just like before. When I told my friends, they exchanged looks. A couple asked if I was sure it was him. Others suggested maybe I was reading too much into it. But I knew. There was a weight in the way he looked at me, like he was waiting for something. That night, I filled out a request to transfer to Morrison Hall, clear across campus. I didn't tell many people, just my boyfriend, one close friend, and the housing office. It felt like the only way to make him lose track of me. 3 days after moving into Morrison, I was heading in from the lot with a couple of grocery bags when I saw him again. This time there was no pretense, no newspaper, no distance. He was walking across the lot directly toward me, his pace deliberate, his eyes locked on mine. I froze for half a second, the plastic bag handles cutting into my fingers, before I screamed. The sound was louder than I'd expected, echoing off the brick walls. I dropped one bag and sprinted for the doors. The sudden noise drew people out from the lobby and nearby benches. 3 students, then more behind them. They saw him too. A couple of guys yelled, and he broke off, turning on his heel and walking quickly toward the street. By the time security arrived, he was gone. But now it wasn't just my word. Other students had seen him coming toward me, seen the way he left as soon as there were witnesses. The resident advisor called me into her office, went over every detail, and assured me it would be taken seriously. That night, lying in my new room, I kept running through the timeline in my head. How had he found me so fast? Only a handful of people knew about the transfer. I hadn't posted anything online, hadn't even changed my mailing address yet. The thought that he might have some way of accessing that information without me knowing kept me awake until the sun came up. The answer came a few days later. Campus police knocked on my door early in the morning. They'd identified him, Robert Mills, a custodial worker employed by the university for over a decade. Through his job, he had access to certain administrative systems, student housing records, maintenance requests, even class schedules in some cases. For weeks, he'd been using that access to track my dorm assignments and daily routine. When they searched his locker, they found a stack of printed photos, me walking to class, sitting at the library, unlocking my dorm door. There were pictures of other women too, some I didn't recognize. Alongside the photos were handwritten notes, detailed down to the minute. When we left buildings, which routes we took, who we were with. He was fired immediately and arrested. The campus alert went out again, this time naming him. But weeks later, I learned the charges had been reduced to misdemeanor stalking. The reasoning, they said, was that he'd never physically harmed anyone. That didn't match the image I couldn't shake. His face inches from the glass door that night in Patterson Hall, the hard look in his eyes as he realized he couldn't get inside. By the end of the semester, I'd made my decision. I transferred to another university, one in a different city. I didn't walk anywhere alone after dark. I kept my blinds closed at night, and I never again assumed that a locked door meant I was safe. I was working at Maria's Family Restaurant during my sophomore year of college in December 2021. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and I'd gotten used to the rhythm. Early prep, the breakfast rush, quiet gaps in the afternoon. That's when he first came in. He was dressed in a sharp suit the first time. Looked like he'd just stepped out of some conference. Mid-40s, maybe. He took a booth in my section and ordered nothing more than coffee and a slice of apple pie. That alone wasn't strange. Plenty of customers sat for hours nursing a coffee. He stayed a long time that first day, though, long after the lunch crowd had cleared. He asked me about my major, what classes I was taking, if I was going home for the holidays. His voice was calm, polite, but his eyes didn't match the easy tone. Too focused, like he was memorizing every answer. I kept moving between tables, making sure I wasn't standing there too long. But he always had another question ready when I came back. He started coming in 2 or 3 times a week, always asking for my section. My manager noticed, but only mentioned that he was a good customer who tipped well. And he did, 20%, sometimes 30%, every time. I told myself he was probably just lonely, maybe traveling for work, looking for someone to talk to. Still, there was something in the way he kept steering conversations back to me, my plans, my family, whether I had a boyfriend, that made me feel like I had to keep my guard up. By the second week, I'd catch myself spotting him the moment he walked through the door. Same routine, coffee, pie, a few minutes on his phone, then hours of talking whenever I passed his table. I learned to cut the conversation short without being rude, telling myself I was just overthinking it. But the unease never really went away, no matter how normal he acted. It didn't take long before it was obvious he knew my work schedule. I'd never told him, but he somehow only showed up when I was there. Even if I picked up an extra morning shift, he'd be in that booth within the first hour. He started making comments about my hair, my smile, my great energy. Once, he asked if I ever went out after work, suggesting we could grab a drink sometime. I brushed it off with a quick laugh and said I was too busy with school. One afternoon, I set his plate down and felt his fingers brush the back of my hand. Not accidental, slow enough that I pulled away instantly. It wasn't aggressive, but it crossed a line. After that, I tried to get other servers to take his table when they could. Sometimes it worked, but he'd ask where I was, if I was around, and wait until I was free. Then he began leaving notes with his tips, folded slips of paper tucked under the receipt. They'd have his phone number written neatly, or little offers. Let me know if you need help with books next semester, or happy to take care of your tuition. The tips themselves got larger, $40, $50 on a $10 tab, but each one made me more uncomfortable. I'd crumple the notes and toss them before I could think too much about them. The rest of the staff saw him hanging around, saw how often he asked for me. A couple of them joked about it, calling him my biggest fan, or saying I'd found myself a sugar daddy. But no one really seemed to think it was serious. I kept telling myself the same thing. But every time I walked past that booth and saw him sitting there, watching me before I even said hello, it felt less and less like a coincidence. Then I started seeing his car in the college parking lot. Same dark sedan, tinted windows, parked a few rows away from where I usually left mine. The first couple of times, I thought it was coincidence. But then, I noticed it again at the bus stop I used on mornings when my car was in the shop. Always in sight, never too close, but close enough that I knew he could see me. One afternoon, I was walking out of the library with my backpack slung over my shoulder when I heard someone call my name. I turned and saw him leaning against that same car, smiling like we were old friends. He said he could give me a ride home since it was getting late. The way he phrased it wasn't casual. It sounded like he'd already decided where I was going. My stomach dropped. I told him no, quick and firm, and walked back inside until he drove off. That's when it hit me that he'd been keeping track of where I was outside of work, learning my schedule without me realizing it. That night, I told my manager everything. How he was showing up at my campus, waiting near the bus stop, approaching me out of nowhere. She didn't hesitate. From that day, she told him he couldn't sit in my section anymore. He didn't argue, but the smile he gave her was tight and wrong, like he wasn't done. For a few days, I thought maybe that would be it. Then one night after closing, I walked out to my car with my keys in hand and saw him standing a few spaces away, leaning on the hood of a pickup. He said he just wanted to talk. I turned around and went back inside. After that, I asked a coworker to walk me out every single night. Sometimes he was there, sometimes not. But the threat of it never went away. When the restaurant banned him entirely, I felt a moment of relief. That lasted less than a week. I started getting texts from an unknown number, short messages, just my name or how was work. Then calls, never leaving a voicemail. When I blocked the number, new ones would pop up. The tone was never explicitly threatening, but the persistence made my skin crawl. Then the social media messages started. New profiles with generic names and no pictures, sending me friendly questions like we'd met before. When I blocked those, more would appear, all clearly the same person. It went beyond me. He started contacting my friends. One told me he'd messaged her asking if she knew where I lived because he was worried I wasn't answering my phone. My parents got calls from a man claiming to be one of my professors. He said I was in trouble, and he needed to confirm my address. They hung up both times, but the idea that he was reaching them directly shook me. It felt like he was mapping out every person connected to me, seeing who would give him something useful. When I finally went to the police, I was told that without direct threats or physical harm, there wasn't much they could do besides file a report. They suggested I document every call, every message, every time I saw his car. So I did. I started a file, screenshots, times, dates, even photos from my phone when I spotted him somewhere he shouldn't be. I changed my phone number, locked down my social media, and told friends not to tag me anywhere. I parked in different lots on campus and never took the same route home 2 days in a row. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the street before walking to my car. The tension never fully left my shoulders. And then, after 3 relentless months, it stopped. No calls, no sightings, nothing. The silence was almost unsettling after the constant pressure of his presence. Weeks later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that his wife had found out. She'd gone through his phone, seen everything, and given him an ultimatum: end it, or she'd leave. That explained the sudden disappearance, but it didn't erase what happened. The whole thing changed the way I moved through the world. I started listening to that small, uncomfortable voice I'd ignored in the beginning. People who dig for personal details without a reason aren't being friendly. They're looking for something. And I learned the hard way that you can't afford to wait until their interest turns into something you can't walk away from. When I was 28, I was working as a receptionist at a small dental clinic downtown, trying to keep my head above water after my engagement had ended and my daughter was born. Money was tight, and most days I was just going through the motions, answering calls, scheduling patients, and helping with paperwork. One of the nurses there, Linda, was friendly with me from the start. She was in her 40s, always joking around, the type who remembered birthdays and brought in cupcakes for the staff. One afternoon during a slow shift, she mentioned her uncle, Frank Miller. She said he was a handyman who lived a few streets away from the clinic and had been through hard times himself. According to her, he'd heard about my situation and just wanted to help. I remember feeling a little awkward about it. He was in his 50s, a stranger to me, but she made it sound harmless. "He's a good man," she said. "He's just one of those people who likes to do things for others. He hates to see someone struggling." A few days later, I got a Facebook friend request from him. His profile picture was of him sitting on the hood of a pickup, wearing a baseball cap and smiling. His messages started out polite, short. He wrote about how strong I was for raising a child alone and how admirable it was that I still came to work every day with a smile. Then he offered to run errands for me if I ever needed, or pick up groceries when he was in the area. Not long after, he mentioned babysitting. "Only if you're comfortable," he said, adding that he'd helped raise his nieces and nephews. I never took him up on it, but I thanked him for the offer. At that point, I saw it as an older man being kind, maybe a little too eager, but nothing that made me think it was dangerous. The messages kept coming though, every couple of days without fail. Over the next few weeks, the tone shifted. His compliments became personal, about my looks, my hair, the way I dressed. He'd write about how he wished he'd met someone like me when he was younger, how a woman like you deserves to be spoiled. One morning after work, I found a small envelope tucked under my windshield wiper in the clinic's parking lot. Inside was a $20 bill and a note that just said, "Lunch on me, Frank." I walked straight back into the clinic and gave it to Linda, asking her to return it to him. She laughed it off and told me he was just being generous. But I told her I wasn't comfortable with it. A week later, there was another envelope, this time with a silver necklace inside. That, too, I handed to Linda to give back. Instead of backing off, it seemed to have the opposite effect. Within a few days, he was waiting for me after work. The first time, I came out to the lot and saw his pickup angled in behind my car, blocking it in. He got out, all smiles, holding a coffee he said he'd brought for me. I told him I couldn't take it, and that I needed to get home. He stood close to my door, talking about how we just clicked, and how he'd been thinking about me all week. I tried to make it clear I wasn't interested, keeping my voice even, saying I wasn't looking to date anyone. He nodded, but there was no sign he'd heard me. After that, it became a pattern. Once or twice a week, he'd be there when my shift ended. Always parked in the same way, making sure I couldn't pull out without speaking to him first. Each time, the conversation was the same. Him talking about how we were meant to be together. Me saying no as politely but firmly as I could. He'd act like I hadn't spoken at all, leaning against my car door, telling me he could make life easier for me, that my daughter could use a father figure. One night, it took almost 10 minutes of repeating myself before he finally stepped away so I could get into my car. Even then, he stood watching in the rearview mirror as I drove off. It started with his truck parked at the far corner of the lot when I got home from work one Tuesday evening. I pulled in, hoping he'd leave if I ignored him. But by the time I reached my door, I could hear his boots on the stairwell behind me. I locked the door fast, my heart pounding. A few minutes later, there was a soft tap at the peephole, and a folded note slid under the door. The paper was creased like he'd been holding it for a while. It was just a few sentences, written in thick blue ink, about how he couldn't stop thinking about me, and how he just wanted to talk. By the end of the week, it wasn't just evenings. His truck showed up in the mornings when I left with my daughter for daycare. I'd see him in the rearview mirror, following until I turned into the parking lot, where he'd drive by slow before disappearing down the street. Once, I caught sight of him inside the grocery store, pretending to browse the meat section while watching us from a few aisles over. Another time, I stepped out of my car at the pediatrician's office and saw him across the lot, leaning on his truck, arms crossed. I stopped sleeping properly. Every time headlights passed my apartment windows, I checked the blinds. The clinic manager noticed I was making mistakes on appointment schedules and pulled me aside. I told her enough for her to let me work from home 2 days a week. She arranged for someone to walk me to my car every night. My coworkers didn't make jokes anymore. They just made sure I wasn't walking out alone. Linda looked mortified when she found out. She told me Frank had always been intense with women he liked, like it was some sort of bad habit he couldn't help. I told her this wasn't intense. It was stalking. She didn't argue, but she didn't look me in the eye either. Then the letters started showing up under my apartment door, not typed or neat, but scrawled like he'd written them in his truck. He wrote about watching me, about how other men couldn't take care of me like he could. One of them mentioned my daughter by name, and that's when my stomach turned cold. It wasn't long before another problem started. His wife. How she found out, I never knew for sure. But one afternoon, the clinic's front desk transferred a call to me, and a woman's voice came on the line, shaking with rage. She accused me of ruining her marriage, of chasing after a married man. I tried to hang up, but she kept calling back. Some calls came to my cell, others to the clinic, sometimes 5 or 6 in a row. When I didn't answer, she left voicemails, her voice rising until she was shouting about how she'd come down there if I didn't stop messing with her husband. She called me a liar, a manipulator, a homewrecker. I started letting everything go to voicemail just to avoid hearing her. The worst part was my daughter hearing the messages I couldn't delete fast enough. "Why is that lady so mad at you, Mommy?" she asked one evening after I'd turned the volume down. I told her it was just a wrong number, but she didn't believe me. The tension was leaking into everything: work, home, even daycare drop-offs. I was checking the parking lot before I left any building. I thought about moving, but I knew it wouldn't stop him. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't know if there was enough for them to act. I'd been hoping he would get bored, or embarrassed, or anything that would make him stop. But it was clear now he wouldn't. Finally, after a week where both he and his wife called me daily, I called a lawyer. She told me to write down everything: dates, times, exactly what was said, and save every letter. She had a cease and desist letter drafted by the next day. It spelled out plainly that if Frank continued to contact me or come near me, we'd pursue legal action for harassment and stalking. His wife was included by name in the letter. The letter went out on a Wednesday. I blocked their numbers, blocked them on social media, and changed my phone number. I didn't hear from either of them again. The silence was like stepping into a warm room after being out in the cold for months. A year later, Linda stopped by the clinic while I was covering the desk. She looked older, more tired. She told me Frank had been arrested for similar behavior toward a woman at his job, a coworker, younger than me, who'd gone to the police right away. He was facing charges, and she didn't think he'd be coming home for a while. I just nodded. There wasn't much to say. I'd learned the hard way that some people will take every courtesy, every polite smile, as an open door. They won't hear no unless it's backed by a consequence. I wished I'd drawn that line sooner. Now I document everything. I don't ignore warning signs. And I don't assume problems like this will go away on their own. Because some people don't stop until you make them. And if you wait too long, you might not get the chance. Back in 2018, I was working as a freelance web designer, picking up clients wherever I could. Samantha reached out to me from Miami. She ran an online cosmetics store and wanted me to overhaul her site. Her priorities were boosting functionality and tightening up the security, so I got started right away. Everything was going smoothly for the first 2 weeks. I'd log in from my home office each morning, run my checks, make changes, test things, and send her updates. Then one afternoon, during what should have been a routine check of the site's back end, I noticed something that made me stop cold. There was a new administrator account in the system. I knew I hadn't created it, and it hadn't been there the day before. The timestamp showed it was made at 3:04 a.m., well outside my working hours, and more importantly, without my knowledge. My first thought was, maybe Samantha had done it herself, so I called her right away. She picked up quickly, sounding casual until I explained what I'd found. Her tone changed instantly. She said she hadn't added any new accounts and didn't know anyone else who would have access. She sounded genuinely surprised, almost uneasy, and told me to delete the account immediately. While we were on the call, she hesitated, then said there was something she needed to tell me. Over the past month, she'd been dealing with a string of bizarre and costly problems. Her bank had contacted her about multiple suspicious charge attempts totaling $2,800, which had led to her credit card being frozen. Then she discovered several transfers had been made from her PayPal account to recipients she didn't recognize. On top of that, her business partners had started calling, confused and angry about rude, unprofessional emails they'd received. Emails sent from her address, but that she swore she never wrote. I started thinking through possible causes, and all of it pointed to one thing. Her computer was compromised. I offered to run a remote diagnostic to confirm, and she agreed. When I got in, it didn't take long to find the problem. Hidden processes were running in the background, quietly sending data out to external servers. The connections were masked, but there were enough traces for me to see it was some kind of malware, likely installed recently. When I told her, she went quiet for a moment, then admitted something that explained how this might have started. A few weeks back, she downloaded some video editing software from a file-sharing site she knew wasn't exactly reputable. She'd needed to edit product videos quickly and didn't want to wait for official software licenses to process. It had seemed harmless at the time. The so-called video editing software was nothing more than a Trojan buried inside a polished installer. Once I dug into its payload, I found it had quietly created backdoors into Samantha's system, giving the hackers full remote control. From there, they'd crawled through every account tied to her main email address, her online banking, PayPal, social media, cloud storage, everything. I explained the situation to her in plain terms and told her this wasn't going to be a quick fix. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked on her system daily. I wiped and rebuilt her operating system from scratch, installed network monitoring tools, and set up a firewall with strict rules. Every password for every account she owned was changed, each one generated randomly and stored in a secure password manager. We enabled two-factor authentication everywhere it was available, and I replaced her outdated antivirus with enterprise-grade protection. Even with those measures, the criminals still managed to drain about $1,500 from different accounts during the cleanup window. They were clearly operating in multiple regions, using stolen credentials while they still worked. We flagged every transaction, froze compromised cards, and sent fraud reports to her bank and PayPal. By the time I declared her system clean, I felt confident they'd lost their grip. Samantha seemed lighter when we finished. She thanked me repeatedly, saying she finally felt like she could focus on her business again. About a month later, just when I thought the whole ordeal was behind us, my phone rang late in the evening. It was Samantha. I could hear her sobbing before she said a word. She'd just received an email from an address she didn't recognize. The message was blunt: pay $5,000 in cryptocurrency within 72 hours, or they would release a set of personal images to her family, friends, and business contacts. Attached was a single photo to prove they weren't bluffing, one she recognized immediately as private and stored only on her laptop. She was shaking when she described it. The hackers had clearly copied personal files during the original breach and kept them. She couldn't stop thinking about who might see them. Clients she had to face daily, her parents, her husband. Her voice broke when she said she didn't know if her marriage could survive it. Then she asked the question I'd been dreading. Could I track them down or erase what they had? I told her the truth. Once files are stolen, there's no way to make them disappear from the attacker's possession. The only real option was to treat it as a criminal matter. She was hesitant, scared that going to the authorities would make things worse. But I explained that paying the ransom didn't guarantee the photos would stay hidden. More often than not, it encouraged further extortion. We talked for nearly an hour before she agreed to loop in her husband. The next day, they went together to the local police and spoke with the cybercrime division. The officers took down every detail: the email headers, the cryptocurrency wallet address, the timestamps, and promised to investigate. They warned her it was rare to identify the culprits, but said the information might link to other active cases. For the next week, she jumped every time her phone buzzed, expecting the worst. But the hackers never followed through. The police speculated they might have been running multiple extortion campaigns at once, abandoning harder targets when easier ones paid up. Whatever the reason, the silence eventually held. The files were never leaked, and the threats stopped coming. When we spoke again after it was over, Samantha told me she still couldn't relax completely. The idea that strangers had copies of her private life, stored who knows where, would always linger. I understood. I'd seen enough breaches to know that data theft leaves scars you can't patch with software. That experience changed the way I work. Now, when I clean a system, I tell my clients that the damage doesn't end the day you remove the malware. Anything stolen during the breach, financial info, business records, personal photos, might surface months or even years later. The only real defense is to avoid letting attackers in at all. With Samantha, we kept in touch for a while after the case closed. She moved her business to a more secure hosting provider, set strict rules about software downloads, and kept her devices under constant protection. But every now and then, she'd email me just to say she'd received a suspicious message and wanted to double-check it was safe. The lesson was burned in for both of us. Once someone gains access to your data, they own a piece of your life you can never take back. All you can do is make sure they never get the chance again. It started on a Wednesday afternoon when I was sitting in the library between classes. My phone buzzed, and I saw a message from a number I didn't recognize. It just said, "Hey, what's up?" I typed back that they had the wrong number, nothing more. A few seconds later, another text came in. "Hi Alex, let's meet up as planned." I told them I wasn't Alex. No emojis, no extra explanation. I expected them to just say sorry and move on, but instead, they wrote, "Who are you then?" It wasn't the kind of follow-up you'd expect if someone genuinely had the wrong number. The tone felt different. It wasn't casual curiosity. It read more like they were digging for something. I stared at the screen for a moment and decided not to answer that question. About a minute later, another text came through. "Answer me right now." The words were blunt, like a demand, not a request. I locked my phone and went back to reading, but I couldn't stop glancing at the screen. I didn't reply. 5 minutes later, another message popped up. "Why are you being difficult?" Then another. "We need to talk." This is important. I didn't recognize the number. I even checked it online to see if it was connected to a scam, but nothing came up. My gut told me not to engage. I put the phone in my backpack, but it started buzzing again. This time it was a video call from the same number. I let it ring out. Then, 30 seconds later, another video call. Declined that one too. When the third call came in, I hesitated. I told myself I just wanted to see who it was, so I could block them properly. Against my better judgment, I swiped to accept. The screen lit up with a grainy, unstable video. The lighting was dim, like whoever it was had their phone in a poorly lit room. At first, all I saw was movement, the camera shifting, maybe their hand adjusting it. No face. Just a shadow against what looked like a bare wall. There was no sound at first, only the faint static of background noise. Then the camera tilted, and I caught a glimpse of a figure standing a few feet back from the phone. The person wasn't looking directly at the camera, more like they were looking slightly to the side, as if waiting for something. I said, "Who is this?" But there was no response. The figure stepped closer, the video auto-focusing for a second before blurring again. I could make out a dark hoodie, the hood up. Their hands were in their pockets. The silence made the whole thing worse. I realized they hadn't called to talk. They just wanted me to see them. I moved my thumb toward the red button to hang up, but before I could, the person leaned in closer to the lens. The hood shadowed most of their face, but I could see their mouth curl into the faintest smile. Then the call cut off on their end. I stared at my reflection on the black screen for a second before locking the phone. The moment the call connected, the image on my phone shifted to what looked like a cramped garage or basement. The ceiling was low, pipes running across it, and a single dangling light bulb flickered weakly in the background. The man's silhouette was sharp against the dim light, tall, broad shoulders, standing still for a few seconds before stepping forward. The video was awful, more like a cheap security camera feed than a normal phone call. The pixels broke apart and reformed constantly, making his face impossible to see clearly. When he finally spoke, his voice wasn't normal, It had that mechanical, stretched quality, like he was using one of those voice changer apps people use in prank calls. Only this wasn't funny. The words were jumbled, each syllable warped so much that they didn't sound like any language I knew. It was almost like he was reading something, but the distortion made it impossible to tell. He moved in and out of the shadows as if pacing, sometimes letting the weak light catch the side of his hood or his hands. When he got close enough to the camera, I could see that the hood was drawn tight around his face, leaving nothing visible except a dark oval where his features should have been. The low ceiling and cluttered background made the space feel even more closed in. The air on my end felt heavier just watching it. He bent slightly toward the camera, the picture glitching with static for a moment, then backed up and disappeared almost completely into the darkness behind him. The voice kept going, low, garbled, constant, but with no rhythm or pauses. I sat there staring, wondering if he could see me, or if this was a pre-recorded video being played back. I tried to look for signs, a reflection, a reaction to my movements, but the quality was too poor to tell. Then, he was gone from the frame. A few seconds passed, and I thought maybe the call had dropped. Suddenly, he reappeared from the opposite side of the shot, moving in slow, deliberate steps. I realized he was circling the space in an odd, theatrical way, like he wanted me to keep guessing where he'd pop up next. The light bulb behind him swung slightly, casting uneven shadows on the walls and floor. At one point, he held something up close to the camera. The object was small, maybe handheld, but the poor lighting made it impossible to identify. It could have been anything: a tool, a phone, even a weapon. He kept it in frame for a second before lowering it again. Then came another object, a different shape, equally unclear. Each time, the voice continued that distorted ramble, never pausing, never reacting. The performance kept shifting. He'd vanish into a corner so dark it looked like the feed had gone black, then emerge suddenly, moving faster, almost jerking forward like the video was skipping frames. The whole thing had a rhythm to it, but not one I could understand. The voice was the only constant, low, mechanical, and full of words I couldn't decipher. I watched for about 2 minutes that way, my grip on the phone getting tighter, my eyes flicking to the clock, counting how long I'd been sitting there without doing anything. When it finally clicked that I didn't have to just keep watching, I pressed the red button and ended the call without hesitation. The screen went black, and for a second I could see my own reflection in it again, my expression tense and still. Before I could think, I opened the Contacts app and blocked the number. It felt like a small, necessary action, but my thumb lingered on the screen as if expecting the block to fail. I stared at the list, making sure the number was gone, and then tossed my phone onto the table like I didn't want it near me. The room was quiet. I half expected the phone to light up again anyway, to buzz with some other unknown number. But it didn't. That was the last time I heard from whoever it was. No more messages, no calls, no missed attempts. Even now, I have no idea who that man was, or what he was trying to accomplish. Maybe it was some elaborate prank, meant to confuse and unsettle whoever answered. Or maybe it was something darker, someone testing how I'd react, seeing if I'd stay on the line. I thought about reporting it, but what would I even say? A man in a basement called me with a voice changer. It sounded ridiculous without proof. Weeks later, I could still remember the way he moved in and out of the shadows, the way the objects were held up like he wanted me to see them but not recognize them. It's the not knowing that stuck with me. The uncertainty made every unknown number feel suspicious after that. I stopped answering calls from people not already in my contacts. If a text came through from someone I didn't know, I'd delete it without opening it. I kept my phone on silent more often, just to avoid the possibility of that kind of intrusion again. Sometimes the memory still creeps back at random moments, while walking alone at night, or when I hear distorted audio in a movie. I'll picture that pixelated frame, the hooded figure, the dim light swinging above his head. I try not to imagine what he would have done if I'd kept watching longer. What unsettles me most isn't what happened. It's what didn't. No threats, no demands, no explanation. Just a performance for an audience of one. And I was the one who stayed and watched. So when Emily and I decided to celebrate our 2-year anniversary, we rented this little cabin way out in the Colorado mountains. The listing made it sound perfect. 30 minutes from the nearest town, surrounded by forest, no neighbors in sight. The drive up was quiet once we got past the last gas station, and the road narrowed to a single lane with tall pines crowding the shoulders. The cabin was set back from the gravel driveway, a small A-frame with a wooden deck out front and a stone chimney. At first glance, it seemed exactly like what we wanted, but as soon as we stepped inside, there were a few things that didn't add up. The bedroom windows were wide open, the kind of open that made the curtains billow when the wind caught them. The air inside was cold, sharper than it should have been for late afternoon. In the kitchen, there was a coffee mug sitting on the counter with a ring of dark liquid dried halfway down the inside. The handle still had a faint smudge, like someone had put it down and never came back for it. When I went to check the back door, the lock was broken. The latch wouldn't catch no matter how I turned it. The door frame had a small crack near the strike plate, as if someone had forced it once and no one had bothered to fix it. Emily stood in the middle of the living room looking around like she was trying to decide if we should even bother unpacking. We tossed a few guesses back and forth about the last guests. Maybe they left in a hurry. Maybe they were just careless, and decided not to overthink it. We'd driven too far to turn back over a busted lock and an abandoned cup of coffee. We brought our bags in, shut the windows, and I wedged the back door closed with a chair. The place had a simple setup. One bedroom, a small living room with a wood stove, and a kitchen that opened onto the deck. The forest outside was dense, dark green under the late summer sun, and you could barely see the sky through the treetops. Despite the odd details, the first day turned out better than I expected. We spent the afternoon hiking one of the trails that started behind the cabin, following a narrow dirt path that wound uphill through the woods. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and we didn't see another person the entire time. By the time we got back, our legs were sore, and the sun was starting to drop. We decided to cook dinner outside on the deck, using the small gas grill that came with the cabin. While we were eating, I made an offhand comment about the front door code, 4729, without really thinking about it. The keypad was mounted just above the handle, and I said something about how easy it would be for someone to guess if they'd seen me type it. I immediately realized saying it out loud probably wasn't the smartest thing, and I half joked about it, tossing out a fake number, 1683, like I was making some kind of spy movie reference. Emily rolled her eyes and told me I was being paranoid. We stayed outside a while after the plates were cleared, listening to the sounds of the forest settling into night. When the air got cooler, we headed inside, making sure to lock everything. I double-checked the windows and the front door, then braced the back door with the chair again. The cabin felt different with the doors shut, quieter, like the walls held the stillness in. By the time we went to bed, the place seemed secure enough. The forest was silent outside, and the only light came from the small lamp on the nightstand. With everything locked up tight, the cabin felt almost cozy. We both fell asleep believing we were completely safe. Around 3 in the morning, I felt Emily's hand shaking my shoulder. Her whisper was urgent, almost panicked. She said someone was at the front door, punching numbers into the keypad. At first, half awake, I thought I'd misheard her. But then I caught the sound for myself. Short, high-pitched beeps in uneven intervals, the pattern of failed attempts. We lay frozen for a few seconds, just listening. The faint glow from the porch light came through the bedroom curtains, and the sounds were distinct enough to know the person wasn't fumbling. They were deliberately trying combinations. My chest tightened because there was no way to accidentally stumble onto the keypad in the dark. Whoever it was knew there was a lock there, and they were confident enough to stand out on that porch and work on it at 3 in the morning. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, motioning for Emily to follow. We crept down the short hallway, bypassing the front windows, and moved into the farthest room in the cabin, the small storage room beside the bathroom. I turned the lock on the inside and pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear if the beeping had stopped. Emily was already pulling out her phone. She dialed the local sheriff's number with shaking hands, speaking in low, controlled words as she explained the situation. She gave our location and said we could hear someone actively trying to get inside. My pulse thudded in my ears while I listened to the occasional beep from the front door still filtering through the quiet cabin. The seconds felt longer and longer, like the air was getting heavier the more we waited. Then Emily said something into the phone that made my stomach turn. She told the sheriff the code the person was trying wasn't random. It was the fake number I'd joked about earlier that night on the deck. 1683. I could hear the disbelief in her own voice as she repeated it for confirmation, like she needed to make sure she wasn't imagining it. That detail changed everything. They hadn't tried the real code, not even once. Just the number I'd tossed out as a joke. Which meant that when we'd been sitting outside in what we thought was complete privacy, someone had been close enough to hear every word. They'd been close enough to remember it, wait until the middle of the night, and come back to try it. I replayed the evening in my head, every sound from the woods, every flicker of movement at the tree line that I'd dismissed as wind or wildlife. Now it felt like we'd been under observation from the moment we pulled up, maybe even before. That coffee mug in the kitchen, the broken back door, the open windows. It wasn't carelessness from a previous guest. Someone had been inside before we got there. Emily stayed on the line with the sheriff while we stayed locked in that back room, hardly breathing, both of us straining to hear any sign of movement. After a while, the beeping stopped. The silence after was worse. We didn't know if the person had left or was now circling to another door or window. Every creak of the cabin's frame made my muscles tense. The sheriff's arrival felt like it took hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. We heard tires crunching on the gravel drive, followed by a male voice calling out. Only then did we unlock the door and step out, hearts still hammering. The front porch was empty. The ground around it showed no clear footprints, just patches of pine needles and frozen dirt. Whoever had been there was gone. The deputy searched the perimeter with a flashlight while the sheriff came inside to ask us questions. He told us there had been multiple reports of attempted break-ins at vacation rentals in the area over the past few weeks. The suspects often waited for guests to arrive, then returned late at night to take what they could while people slept. I didn't say much about the fake code beyond confirming what Emily had told them, but the sheriff's raised eyebrows said he understood the implication. That detail made it less of a random burglary attempt and more like we'd been targeted specifically. Neither of us wanted to spend another minute there. As soon as the deputies left, we stayed awake until daylight, packing our bags without talking much. We loaded the car in silence, the forest around the cabin looking less peaceful than it had when we arrived. We were back on the main road before the sun had fully cleared the treetops, both of us glancing at the rearview mirror more than usual. The trip had been meant to be a quiet, private celebration, but instead we drove away with the heavy knowledge that our privacy had been an illusion from the start. Later, I kept thinking about how easily I'd given away that fake number, how casually I'd assumed no one was listening. I realized that if I hadn't joked about it, they might have tried the real code instead. The wrong combination had been the only barrier between us and someone walking into that cabin in the middle of the night. Now, whenever I'm somewhere unfamiliar, I pay attention to the little details, the open windows, the odd noises, the sense of being watched, and I never assume that a private conversation is truly private. Sometimes, what feels like paranoia is just paying attention before it's too late. When I was 26, I decided to take a solo hiking trip through some of Colorado's lesser-known trails to avoid the heavy tourist traffic. After 2 days of driving and picking my route, I found a secluded valley several miles from the nearest official campground. Pine forest rose sharply on both sides, and a narrow creek wound its way across the valley floor. The only sounds were the wind moving through the branches and the occasional crack of a twig when a deer passed somewhere out of sight. I pitched my small 2-person tent near the tree line, where the ground was firm and flat. After gathering enough deadfall for a small fire, I cooked pasta and ate while watching the sky turn orange, then purple, then dark enough for stars to come out in the clear mountain air. The night was cool, and the silence had that muffled quality you only get deep in the woods. I'd planned to turn in early, but the view overhead kept me sitting by the fire until well past 10. It was close to midnight when I heard movement on the trail leading into the valley. A figure emerged from the darkness. A man with a large backpack, trekking poles, and the posture of someone who'd been walking all day. He looked around my campsite briefly, keeping his distance from the firelight. His clothes were dusty, and his hair stuck out from under a faded cap. "Sorry," he said in a quick, low voice, not making eye contact. "Didn't mean to bother you." Before I could respond, he stepped back into the dark and was gone, his footsteps fading toward the forest. The encounter was strange but brief, and I chalked it up to him looking for a place to set up his own camp. I'd nearly forgotten about it by the time I crawled into my sleeping bag. But a few hours later, I was startled awake by the sound of footsteps approaching again. The fire had long since burned down to embers, and I could just make out the same man's silhouette near the edge of the clearing. He was breathing hard, his movements quick and jerky. In the dim light, I saw his clothes were now streaked with mud, and his face looked tense, almost panicked. I unzipped my tent halfway. "You okay?" I asked. He stepped closer but didn't answer right away. His eyes darted toward the tree line, then back to me, like he was checking for something. "You haven't seen them, have you?" he asked finally, voice low and urgent. "Seen who?" "People," he said, scanning the shadows. "They've been following me since this morning. Stayed back at first, but now they're closer." His hands gripped the straps of his backpack so tightly his knuckles were pale. Every few seconds he looked over his shoulder. I told him I hadn't seen anyone all day, but he didn't seem reassured. His replies grew shorter, vaguer, like he wasn't sure he wanted to explain more. The way he kept shifting his weight and glancing toward the trail made it clear he was on edge, either convinced someone was after him or in the middle of some serious mental spiral. He didn't ask to stay at my camp, didn't even step fully into the clearing, just stood there breathing hard while scanning the trees. He asked why I chose this exact spot and kept pressing for details like there was a hidden plan behind my tent stakes. I told him the ground was flat, the creek was close, and the pines cut the wind. He narrowed his eyes and asked who else was with me. I said no one. Then he asked who sent me and what time I was told to be here. His tone turned sharp, like a cop grilling a suspect. I said again that I was alone, and he'd approached me. He shook his head and said that was exactly what I would say. His questions came faster. Which trailhead did I use? How many miles had I done? What color was my car? Did I have a radio, a sat phone, a drone? He took a step closer and stared at my pack like he could see signals coming out of it. I kept my hands where he could see them, and told him I had a basic inReach, but it was off to save battery. That answer made him frown harder. He said people like me didn't turn trackers off unless they didn't want their bosses to know what they were doing. I offered him water and a protein bar. He took both, but he didn't open them. He turned the bar over like he was checking for a tag. His lips were split and white at the edges, and a dark line of mud ran from knee to boot. He smelled like creek algae and old sweat. Up close, I could see the tiny tremor in his hands. Dehydration, too much sun, low calories. His pupils looked blown wide in the headlamp glare. He looked at me and through me at the same time. Then he said, "If you're here for me, just say it." I told him I wasn't here for anyone. He scanned my camp again, slower. He pointed at my food bag hanging from the limb. "You put that there so they knew which tree to hide behind." I said I'd hung it to keep mice out. He gave a quick dry laugh like he'd caught me. The laugh died fast. He lifted one trekking pole like a guard and started pacing a thin circle around the edge of my clearing, always between me and the trail. Every few steps he'd stop and talk toward the trees. "I see you," he said once. "You can't mask heat." He jabbed the pole at a dead stump and flinched when his tip hit wood. I listened for any second set of footsteps and heard nothing but the creak. When I told him it was just us, he said, "You wouldn't hear them. They're past hearing." Then he turned back on me and asked, "Why are you smiling?" I wasn't. I told him I was trying to keep my face calm. That made him angrier. I tried to steer him towards something practical. I asked how long since he'd had clean water. He shrugged. I asked his name. He didn't answer, only asked mine, and then repeated it a few times like he was measuring how it felt in his mouth. When I suggested we both walk out at first light and meet rangers at the junction, he said roads are the worst places, and they own the junctions. He said they like choke points. He told me not to take my hands out of sight. His pacing widened. He talked about a group that had tailed him since a pass 2 valleys west. 4 people at first, then 3, then 3 again. "You learn their gaits," he said. "One drags a toe. One breathes loud." He pointed at 2 different trees as if each held a man the rest of us couldn't see. His voice swung from whisper to shout like a dial with a broken stop. Each time he raised his voice, my chest tightened. Reason wasn't going to fix this. Distance would. When I said he might be dehydrated and asked if I could boil water, he snapped, "Don't drug me." I lifted the stove out with 2 fingers and set it on a rock where he could see it. I announced each movement. I lit it and filled a pot and waited for a boil. The small roar steadied the air. He stared at the blue flame like it was a trap, and then shifted attention back to the woods. "They'll rush when you're busy," he said. "That's their play." His questions turned to my car and plate, my route in, how long I'd watched this valley before setting down. I kept my voice level, and my answers simple. No extra words to twist. My headlamp beam made faint cones in the breath fog between us. He looked spent but wired, that brittle state where a body is out of fuel but the mind keeps revving. He kept accusing the trees. He kept guarding the trail. When the pot rolled a boil, I poured the water into my metal bottle for a heat pack, and then into a cup with electrolyte powder. He told me to drink first. I took a sip. He nodded once and didn't take any. He walked to where the trail cut in and stood there listening. Pole up. He called a name I didn't catch into the dark. No answer came, but he reacted like there had been one, and retreated from the trees like something had stepped out. There was nothing there. His loop tightened after that. He started asking the same questions in the same order, and each time he added a rough edge. His feet cut grooves into the pine duff. I answered the same way and kept my hands visible and my body square, not bladed. My plan formed in plain steps. Keep the light on him, keep the distance, pack slow, and leave the moment he drifted. He didn't want to get closer to the fire, so the far half of the clearing kept pulling him like a tide. Twice he disappeared into the trunks for 10 seconds at a time, then returned, jerky and alert. On the third time he faded further. His voice dropped to a mumble, then stopped. The only sounds were the creak and a pine creaking in the cold. I slid my sleeping bag into its sack. I stowed the stove. Every zipper I pinched to kill the noise. My ears worked as hard as my hands. I left the tent for last. When he paced deep enough that the headlamp no longer caught him, I pulled the poles, rolled the fabric tight, and slid it down the side of my pack. I cinched straps until nothing dangled. I kept the light low, kept it off him. I shouldered the pack and paused. No return footsteps. I took 2 steps, then 4, then reached the first trees. I didn't take the trail. I cut uphill through open trunks so I wouldn't pass his chosen doorway. My beam went short and tight and stayed pointed down so I didn't flash my own eyes. I moved slow enough to place every step quiet. 50 steps. Stop. Listen. The forest had that held breath stillness you only notice when you're trying to move quietly. Somewhere to my left, a twig snapped. I froze until the cold started to leak through my jacket and the sound didn't repeat. Deer, elk, him, I didn't know. I moved. It took longer than I liked to reach the old fire road, but when the grade evened and the trees fell back, the relief was real. I killed my lamp and walked by the narrow gray of the road. Dawn was a smear behind the ridge. The brown gate showed up, and then my car. Frost crystals ran along the windshield like fish scales. I got in, locked the doors, and let my breathing catch up while the heater blew air that stayed cold for a full minute. The ranger station sat where the pavement met the dirt. I parked, rang the bell, and a sleepy voice answered. I explained. A male hiker in distress, alone, paranoid, possibly dehydrated and hypothermic, last seen in a small valley off the east spur. I gave coordinates, clothing, pack color, pole brand, and the direction he'd been moving. I said he'd pointed a trekking pole at me and told me not to move my hands. The ranger asked if I felt threatened. I said yes. He asked if the man had a weapon. I said not that I could see, only poles and a heavy pack. He said they'd wake the on-call team and call county SAR. He told me I'd done the right thing and not to go back up. I said I wouldn't. He took my number in case they needed a formal statement. I signed a quick incident form through the slot. I sat in my car after that and watched the light climb the pines. A green truck rolled in. 3 people in red jackets loaded litters and a med bag. One of them carried a hypothermia wrap. I thought about cracked lips, a too light laugh, a pole held like a spear. I thought about how an empty forest can feel crowded when someone insists it is. My hands felt steady again only when the truck pulled out and the taillights disappeared around the bend. I never heard what they found. Maybe he drifted to the creek and slept, and they walked him out. Maybe he kept moving and came out on a road an hour after I left. Maybe he slipped and they found him much later. Search logs are brief and hard to match if you weren't the one who called. I checked for a week and then stopped. What stayed with me wasn't the midnight hike or the packing in silence. It was how fast a normal night can turn when another person's map of the world tears away from the real one. Out there, safety is distance and light, and simple plans you can execute under stress. That night taught me that the scariest thing in the mountains isn't teeth or weather. It's a human voice close by that won't accept what is real, and the small work you do to back out of its reach. I headed home. Back in 2016, I was working as an IT specialist. My work kept me online most of the time, and I had a habit of browsing anonymous networks to find rare technical books I couldn't get anywhere else. It was never anything shady, just obscure programming manuals, outdated hardware repair guides, or niche academic texts that were impossible to locate through normal stores or libraries. I'd been doing it for years without a single problem. It was almost routine for me. Boot the secure setup, mask my location, and quietly download what I needed. That evening started the same way. I sat at my desk, a mug of coffee beside the keyboard, half listening to the faint hum of the cooling fan. I'd just finished setting up a fresh search with broader parameters, hoping I might turn up some long-forgotten engineering references. One of the results looked different. It didn't list a file or a book. It looked more like a service listing. The title was vague, but the short description mentioned specialized orders and information retrieval. It wasn't the kind of thing you'd see connected to public archives. Curiosity made me click. The catalog page loaded slowly, a plain background with simple black text. It listed services in short bullet points, each one more suspicious than the last. Locating individuals, sourcing private documents, and custom operations, with no further details. None of it sounded legal. I should have closed the tab right there, but I wanted to see how it was structured. Maybe it was an elaborate scam, or maybe just fake bravado to lure in gullible people. I clicked one more internal link. The moment the page started loading, my browser froze for half a second. A notification popped up, but it wasn't from the website. It was from my operating system. It was warning me that an application was attempting to access my webcam. I'd seen that message before, but only when I was starting a video call. My hands froze on the keyboard. The small built-in camera at the top of my laptop had a tiny LED indicator that was always off unless I deliberately turned it on. Now, without me touching anything, that light blinked on. I stared at it, pulse hammering, knowing exactly what that meant. Someone, somewhere, had just activated my camera remotely. The page I'd clicked wasn't just a catalog. It was bait, and I'd stepped right into it. My own face was probably filling someone's screen at that moment, the reflection of my room, the desk, everything behind me all visible. I didn't think. I slammed the browser shut, hitting the touchpad so hard the window lagged before closing. The camera light stayed on for another second, then finally went dark. I sat back, staring at the laptop, trying to think through what they could have grabbed. My face, obviously. Maybe even my surroundings. My room wasn't distinctive, but if they could get a location, it would be enough to connect me to the visit. I was using an anonymous network, but there were always vulnerabilities. If these people were as connected as they claimed on that site, they might have tools to work around it. The weight of that thought hit fast. I wasn't dealing with harmless hackers or online pranksters. If someone was running a service to find people or pull private records, they weren't amateurs. If my identity ended up linked to them, it wouldn't just be an embarrassment, it could end my career. Even worse, I had no idea what else they might try next. I pushed my chair back and restarted the system immediately, fingers tight on the power button until it shut off. When it came back on, I launched my security suite and started a full antivirus scan across every file, every drive. While it ran, I unplugged the Ethernet cable, switched off the router, and yanked the USB Wi-Fi dongle out of its port. If they were still connected somehow, I wanted that link severed completely. My mind kept circling the possibility that it could have been a false trigger. Zoom and Skype were still running in the background from earlier, and both had permissions for camera use. But the timing was too sharp. I clicked a link. The warning flashed, the camera light came on, and the page hadn't even finished loading. I didn't like coincidences like that, not when they could mean someone was recording me without my consent. I stayed there, watching the scan progress bar crawl forward, the laptop fan running louder under the extra load. My coffee had gone cold, and the room felt too quiet. All I could do was wait for the results, every second feeling like an hour, wondering if somewhere out there, someone was already replaying those few seconds of footage. The next few days were exhausting in a way I'd never experienced before. Every time I turned on my laptop, I felt like I was putting my head back in a noose. I kept replaying the moment the camera light came on, wondering if they'd managed to capture a still image or record video. If they had, what could they do with it? An image of me in my own room could be tied to my username somewhere, linked to an IP address, traced back to my home. I searched the site name, pieces of the URL, even certain phrases I remembered from the page, but almost nothing came up. It was like it didn't officially exist. The few mentions I found were vague forum posts with warnings to stay away. Nothing that gave me a lead on who was behind it or where they were operating from. Every small interruption made my pulse jump. A phone call from an unknown number, an email that didn't match any contact I knew. It all felt like the first step of someone reaching out to threaten me. I started checking my social media accounts several times a day, scrolling through my tags and mentions to make sure nothing strange had been posted. My focus at work crumbled. I'd stare at my monitor, hands on the keyboard, but my mind would wander right back to the thought of my face staring out from some criminal's database. I considered going to my boss and explaining, but the thought of putting that kind of suspicion on myself, connecting my name to anything that hinted at illegal services, made my stomach knot. It would only raise questions I didn't want anyone asking. By the end of that week, I was barely sleeping, my nights spent staring at the ceiling in the dark. I'd pick up my phone to check if anything new had appeared online about me, then set it down, only to repeat the same check 20 minutes later. I made the decision to overhaul the way I approached everything online. The first step was cutting out any anonymous network activity that wasn't absolutely necessary. If it wasn't a resource I had used before without incident, I didn't touch it. I built a separate virtual machine just for experimenting, one with no personal files, no saved passwords, and no links to my actual hardware. My main system was reserved for verified, safe connections only. Weeks passed, and no one contacted me. No threatening messages, no ransom demands, nothing posted with my name attached to it. Still, the silence didn't relax me. It kept me guessing. I started taking different routes to work, switching up my schedule so my movements wouldn't be predictable. I ignored almost every unknown call and avoided clicking on any link in a message unless I was certain where it came from. Social media became just a tool for work-related announcements. I stopped sharing anything personal. No photos, no location tags, no casual updates. At night, I'd lie in bed and think about how close I'd come to opening a door I couldn't close again. I'd known there were bad actors out there, but I'd underestimated how quickly they could reach across the screen and touch something in my real life. That thought kept me from sleep more than once, sitting in the dim light of my kitchen with a cup of coffee, scrolling through security blogs and incident reports, trying to learn from other people's mistakes. Eventually, the knot in my chest started to loosen. I never saw my image pop up anywhere, never got a call from a blocked number demanding money, never heard from the operators of that site again. But the experience stayed with me. It was like a scar you couldn't see but always knew was there. I understood now that technical skill didn't make you untouchable. You could follow every safety guideline you knew, keep your systems updated, route your traffic through multiple layers, and still be one click away from a situation you couldn't control. My curiosity had nearly given someone a direct line into my life. And for what? A few minutes of poking around a shady catalog that I had no business opening. No one needed to threaten me for the impact to be real. The damage had been done in my own head. For months afterward, I felt myself hesitate before clicking anything unfamiliar, even on completely legitimate sites. I'd second-guess my own judgment, remembering the exact moment when my better sense told me to close the page. and I didn't. Now, I don't wander far from proven, trustworthy resources. I don't let myself believe that a quick look can't hurt. If a door looks like it leads somewhere I don't belong, I leave it shut. Curiosity isn't worth the cost of wondering for the rest of your life who might be on the other side, watching. Last summer, I spent my vacation with my friend Brad at his family's ranch in Texas. The house was built back in the 1960s, but Brad's grandfather had recently put in one of those modern smart home systems. Automatic lighting, climate control, all that stuff. Most of our days were taken up helping with the horses and fixing fences around the property. The work was hard, but I liked being outside and learning from Brad's family. His grandfather never seemed to slow down, always tinkering with something around the ranch, even though everyone said he was supposed to be taking it easy. Brad mentioned once that his grandfather had been acting a little secretive lately, but we figured maybe he was planning some surprise for the family. One evening, we were heading back toward the house after checking the far fence line when something caught our attention. There was light coming from the old barn. That place hadn't been used in years, not according to anything Brad or his family had told me. The windows were dusty, the doors warped and swollen from the weather. But from the house, you could clearly see light leaking through the cracks in the boards. Brad immediately called his grandfather to see if maybe someone had a reason to be out there. His grandfather sounded confused, almost irritated, and said nobody had been in that barn for a long time. From where we stood, the lights were impossible to miss, so something was definitely going on. Brad grabbed the keys. He kept a full set because we had access to all the buildings for daily chores, and we both decided we should check it out. If someone had broken in, we needed to know. If it was just an electrical problem, we still needed to handle it before something sparked a fire. The barn was a good walk from the main house, far enough that it sat on the edge of the property where the field started giving way to treeline. We brought flashlights just in case, though with how bright the glow was inside, I doubted we'd need them right away. As we closed the distance, we could see more clearly. Multiple lights were on inside, not just one. We unlocked the barn doors and stepped into something that neither of us had been expecting. The interior looked nothing like the dusty, abandoned space I'd seen from the outside. The smell of freshly cut wood filled the air. A full woodworking setup dominated the center. Long workbenches lined with clamps and vices, rows of hand tools hanging neatly on wall racks, and stacks of lumber arranged in perfect order against the far wall. Bright, warm light came from a series of vintage-style fixtures overhead, each one clearly retrofitted with new wiring. The place was spotless. Not a trace of dust or cobwebs, no piles of junk in the corners. In fact, the entire space looked like it was being used daily. Several half-finished pieces of furniture were set out. A pair of ornately carved dining chairs, a coffee table with inlaid wood patterns, and what looked like the beginnings of a large cabinet. The level of craftsmanship was obvious even without touching anything. Whoever had been working here knew what they were doing, and they cared about getting every detail right. Brad stepped slowly around the nearest workbench, picking up a smooth, sanded table leg and running his fingers along the grain. This is all his," he said quietly, as if speaking too loud might somehow expose the space to someone outside. We both knew in that moment who had been here and why the barn had been lit up. It was clear that Brad's grandfather had been secretly converting the barn into a personal workshop. Every tool was in its place, every surface organized, and the installation of the lighting system was clean and professional. This wasn't some quick hobby setup. It had been carefully planned and worked on for months, maybe longer. Brad's expression shifted as he looked around. There was no anger, but there was confusion, maybe even a little hurt. He'd been raised believing his grandfather shared almost everything with the family, and now we were standing in the middle of something he had kept hidden from everyone. We moved deeper inside, stopping to examine the furniture pieces. They weren't just functional, they were beautiful. Each joint fit perfectly, every curve sanded smooth. These weren't beginner projects. This was the work of someone who had spent years perfecting his skill. "I don't get it," Brad muttered. "Why hide this?" Then we both remembered the timing. His grandfather had undergone surgery just a few months earlier. The doctors had told him to avoid strenuous activity, and the family had been keeping a close eye on him ever since. Heavy lifting, long hours on his feet. Those were things he wasn't supposed to do. If they'd known he was out here working with saws and hauling wood, they'd have shut it down instantly. The pieces fit together quickly. This barn wasn't just a workshop. It was a place where Brad's grandfather could keep busy, feel useful, and do something he loved without being told to stop. He wasn't hiding it out of shame. He was protecting it. We didn't talk much more that night. After a final look around, Brad locked the doors again, and we walked back to the house in silence. The next morning, Brad told me he wanted to speak to his grandfather alone. I stayed in the kitchen while they sat on the porch. Through the screen door, I caught only bits and pieces of their conversation. Brad started by telling him that we'd found the barn lit up and decided to check it out. There was a pause, and then his grandfather asked if anyone else knew. Brad told him no, and that it would stay that way. He said he understood why the workshop was kept secret, that he knew it wasn't about lying to the family. It was about holding on to something that mattered. After a while, I heard his grandfather's voice soften. He explained that woodworking gave him a reason to get up early, to plan his day, to keep his hands and mind busy. It made him feel like himself again. He'd kept it private because he didn't want to argue with people who would only see the risk and not the reward. Brad promised they'd work something out so he could keep using the barn without worrying about anyone shutting it down. His grandfather thanked him, and from the sound of it, a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. Over the next few days, we didn't bring it up with anyone else. The barn stayed locked, except when Brad's grandfather went out there, and when he did, Brad would sometimes wander in to lend a hand. It became an unspoken agreement. His space, his rules, and no interference. Before I left the ranch at the end of the summer, I stopped by the barn one last time. The chairs we'd seen before were finished now, polished and gleaming in the sunlight coming through the open doors. His grandfather was there, sanding the edges of a new tabletop. He looked up, gave me a nod, and went right back to work. On the drive back home, I thought about how easily we could have gone to the family and blown the whole thing wide open. But it wouldn't have helped him. It would only have taken away something that kept him happy and motivated. Sometimes people keep secrets not because they're doing something wrong, but because they're protecting the things that give their life meaning. That summer, I learned that leaving those secrets alone can be the kindest thing you can do. A few months ago, I was trying to reach an auto shop about getting my pickup truck repaired and accidentally dialed the wrong number. The man who answered had a suspicious tone and immediately asked why I was calling and what I wanted. I told him it was just a mistake, that I was trying to reach a mechanic about my truck. There was a pause, then he said, "I see," in this really flat, cold voice. No goodbye, no other words, just hung up. About an hour later, the same number called me back. I answered right away, but there was only silence on the other end for a few seconds before they hung up again. I stared at my phone, thinking maybe they were trying to figure out who I was. It was weird, but I didn't feel alarmed yet. I figured maybe the guy was just confused or irritated I had called in the first place. I went on with my day and didn't think much more about it until the following evening. It was around 8:30 when I noticed headlights through the blinds in my living room. I peeked out and saw a dark sedan parked directly across from my house. My street was a quiet residential area. Most nights there weren't even cars driving by after dinner. This one was sitting there, engine off. The driver got out and stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, just looking at my house. At first, I thought maybe he was waiting for someone nearby, but he never moved. He wasn't on his phone, wasn't smoking, wasn't pacing, just standing there. I stayed at the window, watching him. He didn't glance around the neighborhood or check a watch. His attention never left my place. He stayed like that for 20 minutes before getting back into the car. I expected him to drive off, but he just sat there. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, maybe some rideshare driver waiting for a fare, but something about it didn't fit. His car didn't have any stickers or lights, and he'd been too focused on my house. By 10 p.m., the car was still in the exact same spot. The guy hadn't gotten out again. I went from telling myself I was overthinking to wondering if this had anything to do with that wrong number from the night before. The timing felt too close to be a coincidence. When I finally went to bed an hour later, I looked out one last time. The car was still there, no lights on inside. I left my bedroom blinds slightly open so I could see from the bed. I barely slept, waking up every hour to check. Every time, the car was still parked there, unmoving, until sometime just before sunrise when it was suddenly gone. The next morning started quiet, but by mid-morning, I saw movement outside that didn't sit right with me. Two men in plain clothes and baseball caps were walking down my street. At first glance, they looked like anyone out for a stroll, but I noticed they slowed down significantly when they got in front of my house. Their heads would tilt toward my yard, their eyes scanning. They didn't carry phones, dogs, or groceries, just empty hands in jacket pockets. I watched from the living room window as they continued past, only to reappear from the opposite direction 10 minutes later. Same behavior, slowing, looking, then walking on. It wasn't subtle. Over the next hour and a half, I counted them walking by more than a dozen times, coming from different ends of the street, as if to make it seem random. But the repetition was obvious. Around 4 in the afternoon, I stepped outside under the pretense of bringing in my trash bin. The men weren't around just then, but I could feel eyes on me from somewhere. That evening, as the sun was going down, I happened to glance out the front window. Someone was cutting across my lawn, moving quickly toward the narrow space between my house and the neighbors. By the time I got to the door, they were already disappearing into the shadows between the houses. I didn't see their face or clothes clearly. I had no idea how long they'd been out there or what they had been doing. The way they moved, fast, no hesitation, made it obvious they didn't want to be seen. The following days had the same pattern, only with more variety. One afternoon, a silver SUV pulled into my driveway. I figured maybe they were lost, but instead of stopping to ask for directions, they immediately backed out and drove away. A few hours later, a different car did the exact same thing. Both times they had plenty of other places to turn around that didn't involve pulling up to my front door. I started noticing people on foot too, ones I didn't recognize. They'd appear on my street at odd hours, not the usual joggers or dog walkers. Some came by in the early morning when it was still dim outside. Others passed close to midnight, when my street was otherwise dead silent. Then there were the parked vehicles. A dented blue sedan sat 2 houses down for almost 3 hours one afternoon. Nobody got out. Later that night, a pickup truck idled a block away, engine running, lights off, for so long that I wrote down its plate number. That's when I began keeping a log of everything. License plates, car descriptions, times, even weather conditions. I figured if something happened, I'd want a clear record to give the police. And the more I wrote down, the more obvious it became that these events weren't random. Every strange vehicle, every unfamiliar person, every odd drive-by had started after that wrong number call. It was the only trigger I could connect to the sudden attention. My gut told me that whoever I'd accidentally called was behind it. Whether they thought I was law enforcement, a reporter, or someone from a rival group, I didn't know. I debated calling the police, but I kept imagining the conversation, trying to convince an officer that a series of glances, walk-bys, and parked cars added up to something serious. Without clear evidence of a crime, I doubted they'd do much. So I waited, kept logging, and stayed alert. After about a week of constant tension, I realized the activity was slowing down. Fewer walk-bys, fewer strange cars. The parked vehicles were gone within minutes instead of hours. 2 days later, I didn't see a single unfamiliar face or car the entire day. And then, just like that, it stopped. I never found out who they were or what they'd wanted. My best guess is still that I'd stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to touch, called a number tied to something illegal, maybe organized crime or some other group that didn't take chances with strangers contacting them. They might have thought I was checking them out, running surveillance of my own, and decided to get ahead of it. Maybe after a week of watching, they figured out I was just some random guy with a broken-down truck. Or maybe they just moved on to another problem. I didn't exactly want to know. The whole thing taught me how quickly something small, something as harmless as dialing the wrong number, can spiral into something you can't control. I still live in the same house, but I'm more cautious now. I pay attention to every car that drives by twice in a short span. I notice faces I don't recognize. I keep my front blinds angled so I can see out without being seen in. Every so often, I'll catch sight of a slow-moving car or someone pausing at the corner, and for a split second, I feel that same tightness in my chest I had that week. It always turns out to be nothing. Still, I've learned that nothing stays nothing forever, and that being on the radar of the wrong people, even for a moment, can be enough to make you realize how easy it is to lose the comfort of feeling invisible. Back in 2018, when I was 24, I was renting an apartment in a big residential complex in a Denver suburb. The place had multiple long buildings with 3 floors each, most with small balconies that faced either the central courtyard or the parking lot. I worked as a manager at one of the larger stores in the local mall, which meant I usually didn't get home until late in the evening after closing and finishing the nightly reports. My schedule was the same almost every day, and I usually parked in the same row near the light pole about halfway down the lot. From my car to my building's main door was about a 2-minute walk across open pavement, no trees or corners, just enough distance that anyone looking from the balconies could see me without much trouble. I'd been living there for about 6 months without a single problem. I knew a few neighbors by face and had maybe 2 people I'd nod to when we crossed paths. The summer evenings were warm enough that people were usually outside smoking or sitting on their balconies. Nothing about the place had ever made me feel unsafe. Then, in late June, something started happening that I couldn't quite explain at first. The first time, I just parked after a late shift. I shut my car door, started walking toward the building, and somewhere above me, from one of the balconies, I heard a sharp, short whistle. It wasn't a tune or a song, just 2 clear notes, like someone trying to get my attention. I glanced up, but in the dark, I couldn't tell which balcony it came from. Nobody called out, so I ignored it and went inside. The next night, it happened again. Same walk, same distance from the building, and the whistle came at almost the exact moment I stepped away from my car. I looked up longer this time, scanning the 2nd and 3rd floors, but there was no movement, no obvious figure leaning on a railing. At first, I told myself it had to be random. People hung out on their balconies all the time. Maybe someone was whistling at a friend or their dog. But a week later, after it had happened 3 more times, the timing started to feel off. Each time, it began exactly when I came into view from the lot. The sound never started early or late. It was like whoever it was waited for me. I tried to pay closer attention after that. If I came home in daylight, I checked the balconies from the parking lot before getting out of my car. Even then, nothing stood out. No one obviously watching, no group of friends out drinking, just the occasional smoker leaning over a rail. Still, within seconds of me locking my car, the whistle would cut through the air. It was never loud enough to seem aggressive, but it was direct. I could feel it aimed at me. It wasn't just nights anymore either. Twice, I left in the morning for an early shift, and it happened then too. Once in the middle of the day, when I'd gone out to grab groceries, I came back, arms full of bags, and as soon as I stepped onto the main path, the whistle started. Always the same 2 notes, never changing. By mid-July, it was routine. If I stepped into that open stretch between my car and the building, I could count down a few seconds and hear it. I didn't tell anyone right away because it seemed small, just a noise from somewhere above. But it had stopped feeling random. The person had to be watching, waiting for me specifically. That's when I started changing how I walked from the lot. I'd look down, keep my pace steady, and avoid glancing at the balconies, even though I could feel the urge to check. Once, I stopped in the lot for a minute, pretending to check my phone before heading toward the building, hoping to catch them off guard. But as soon as I took my first step toward the entrance, the whistle came again, like clockwork. It didn't matter if I parked farther away or came in from the side. If I crossed that stretch where the balconies had a clear line of sight, it would start. And it didn't stop until I went inside or got in my car to leave. By then, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whoever it was had been doing this for weeks, and they knew exactly when I was outside. I started feeling a knot in my stomach every time I thought about walking across that lot. To test my theory, I started asking friends to stop by and hang around the complex at different times, just to see if the whistling would happen when they walked from the lot to the building. I told them not to mention me, not to knock on my door right away, and to pay attention to anything unusual. Over the course of a week, 3 different friends came by during the times I was usually home. Not once did they hear anything. They even lingered outside longer than necessary, looking around as they walked. Nothing. That pretty much confirmed what I'd suspected. The whistling was meant for me, and only me. I decided to mix things up even more. Instead of parking in my usual row near the light pole, I started leaving my car on the far side of the lot, or even closer to the street. Sometimes I'd come in from the opposite side of the building, taking a longer route. But it didn't matter. The same thing kept happening. Whoever it was had their eyes on me, no matter where I parked. It made me realize this person wasn't just casually noticing me by chance. They were actively paying attention, tracking when I came and went. That awareness started to wear me down fast. I'd sit in my car after pulling in, just staring at the building, knowing that the moment I opened my door, the whistling would start. Sometimes I'd delay going home altogether, wandering around the grocery store or driving aimlessly, just so I wouldn't have to walk across that lot. Even inside my apartment, I found myself keeping the blinds shut, worried someone might be watching from another building. It felt like I'd lost the ability to relax in my own space. The stress began bleeding into everything else. I was distracted at work, missing small details I'd never normally overlook. My sleep suffered because I'd lie awake imagining someone outside my window, just standing there. I started triple-checking the locks before bed, not because I thought they'd break in, but because I couldn't stop imagining it. The idea that someone was keeping tabs on me at all hours made my skin crawl. By late July, I'd already started looking at rental listings in other neighborhoods. The thought of moving felt overwhelming, but staying there was worse. Then, one morning after an early grocery run, I walked up to my car and froze. Tucked under the windshield wiper was a folded piece of paper. My stomach dropped before I even opened it. Inside, in messy handwriting, was an apology for coming across the wrong way. The writer claimed they'd been admiring me from afar and wanted to finally introduce themselves. They suggested coffee or dinner sometime, signed their name, and even included an apartment number, one in the neighboring building just across the courtyard. Reading it made everything click into place. This wasn't just some harmless balcony habit. The person had been watching me for weeks, maybe months, and now they'd taken the step of contacting me directly. The note didn't sound threatening on the surface, but something about it made my chest tighten. The casual way they mentioned watching from afar confirmed they knew exactly what they'd been doing. I didn't even take the groceries inside first. I went straight to the property management office, note in hand, and explained everything. How the whistling had been happening for weeks. How it was always timed with my arrivals and departures. How my friends never heard it. And now this. The manager's expression shifted from polite listening to real concern as I talked. She took the note from me, said they'd speak to the resident immediately, and assured me they took stalking behavior seriously. She promised to follow up once they had addressed it. The next couple of days were tense. I avoided walking past the neighboring building and kept my head down when I was outside. But then something unexpected happened. The whistling stopped. Completely. No matter what time I came or went, there was nothing but the usual background noise of the complex. Even with the silence, I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. Every time I stepped outside, I caught myself glancing at the balconies, scanning for movement. The relief of not hearing that sound was real, but it didn't undo the months of tension or erase the image of someone sitting there, waiting for me to appear. By the end of the week, I'd made up my mind. I gave my 30-day notice and started packing. I found a small place in a quieter neighborhood, farther from the mall but worth the extra drive. Moving day couldn't come fast enough. When I finally turned in my keys, I felt a weight lift. But the experience left a mark. I'd gone from feeling completely safe in my home to realizing how quickly that security could be stripped away by someone's fixation. What had started as 2 short notes of a whistle had turned into a constant source of anxiety, shaping my every decision for months. It taught me that these things don't usually start with something extreme. They build. Little behaviors, seemingly harmless, can be signals of something more deliberate. I learned to trust the unease in my gut, even when I couldn't explain exactly why something felt wrong. Now, I'm much more alert when I'm outside. I notice who's around, who's watching. If something feels off, I don't wait to see if it gets worse before acting. I've made it a rule to report anything unusual early, whether to management, security, or the police. That single step of taking it seriously can make all the difference. I still think about that note sometimes. I never saw the man who wrote it face to face. I don't know if he moved on to bothering someone else, or if the complaint was enough to make him stop altogether. I don't really want to know. What I do know is that ignoring those first instincts would have kept me there, in the middle of a situation I had no control over. Now, in my new place, I park under a streetlight, right outside my window. I keep my blinds open during the day, not because I want people looking in, but because I refuse to live like I'm hiding. It's a small way of taking back the space in my own life, a way of reminding myself that I'm the one deciding how I live, not the person watching from above. When I was 14, my friends and I would meet almost every evening after school to hang out at the basketball court near the edge of our neighborhood. It wasn't anything fancy, just 2 faded hoops on cracked asphalt, surrounded by a chain-link fence that rattled when the wind blew. That night, we had stayed later than usual. The streetlights had just flickered on, and the shadows from the trees made the path home feel longer. Someone suggested we cut through the backyard of a house a couple of blocks away. It would shave off several minutes from the walk, and we'd done it before without any problems. The place always looked empty. Overgrown grass, peeling paint, no car in the driveway. We slipped through the gap in the fence along the side, our sneakers crunching on the dry leaves scattered across the yard. The only sounds were the faint hum of a TV from a house down the street and the distant whoosh of cars on the main road. We were halfway across the patchy lawn when I noticed movement in the corner of my eye. A kitchen window was lit from inside. Behind the glass, a man was standing, his face shadowed, but his eyes locked directly on us. I didn't even have time to say anything before the front door burst open. The slam echoed in the quiet street. Out came a middle-aged guy, stumbling slightly but moving fast, his voice already raised. He was yelling about thieves and criminals, his words cutting through the night air. My friends froze for a second, then started backing away toward the fence. I turned to follow, but before I could move, his hand shot out and grabbed my sleeve. His grip was rough, pulling me off balance, so I stumbled toward him. He shook me hard, the smell of stale beer rolling off him even from that distance. "Where are my tools?" he barked, his face flushed. "You think you can just sneak in here and take my stuff?" I tried to pull back, but his fingers tightened around the fabric, twisting it. The others were already halfway to the fence, glancing back at me but not stopping. My pulse picked up as his voice got louder, each word more aggressive than the last. The smell of alcohol hit me like a solid wall when he leaned in close. His breath was hot, sour, and overwhelming. His words were slurred, but the rage in them was sharp. "Kids like you've been stealing from my shed," he said, shaking me again. "I know it's you. Don't lie to me." I tried to speak, forcing out, "I've never been here before." But it was like talking to a brick wall. His eyes were glazed but locked on mine, his brow furrowed deep. Each time I denied it, his grip seemed to get stronger. The muscles in his forearm tensed against my arm, and no matter how I twisted or pulled, he didn't let go. His voice rose until it was almost a shout, bouncing off the siding of the house and carrying into the street. The porch light above us cast his shadow over me, making him seem even larger. I glanced toward the fence, expecting to see one of my friends still there, maybe about to come back. But they were gone. Not just gone from the yard, gone completely, their silhouettes nowhere on the sidewalk or street. They had bolted the moment things turned ugly, leaving me alone with this drunk stranger in his yard. My stomach dropped. The man's grip jerked me closer again, my shoulders straining. He kept demanding to know where his missing tools were, his voice now edged with something harsher than just anger. His free hand twitched like he didn't know whether to push me or hit me. I could feel my legs tensing, my weight shifting like I might try to break free. But his arm was like a clamp on mine. The street was quiet except for his ragged breathing and the faint buzz of the porch light above. The space around us seemed to shrink. His eyes were locked on mine, unblinking, his breath hitting my cheek with every word. The way he was looking at me wasn't just suspicion. It was the kind of certainty that doesn't listen to reason. And as his voice climbed higher, the air seemed thicker, and my chest felt tight. My mind was racing through ways to get out, but my body stayed locked in place, his fingers still knotted in my sleeve. I started yelling as loud as I could, my voice cracking from the strain. "Help! Somebody help me!" The man's eyes widened and he lunged forward, trying to slap his hand over my mouth. I twisted my head away, pushing against his chest with my free arm. His fingers brushed my cheek, but I managed to turn and scream again, the sound echoing down the street. He cursed under his breath and tried once more to muffle me, his breath hot and heavy in my ear. I kept jerking my head side to side, my shouts breaking into sharp, panicked bursts. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was in my throat. Then, suddenly, a door banged open from inside the house. An older woman, maybe in her late 60s, stepped onto the porch, her slippers slapping against the wood. Her voice cracked as she yelled, "Michael! What in God's name are you doing?" She stormed toward us, her face pale and tight with shock. In 2 quick steps, she was beside him, her small hand gripping his arm with surprising force. "Let him go right now!" she barked. Her voice had the kind of authority that even in his drunken haze he seemed to recognize. He hesitated, muttering something I couldn't make out, but her grip tightened, and she yanked him back a step. I stumbled free, gasping for air and rubbing my sleeve where his hand had been. She turned to me with wide eyes, shaking her head. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. He's my son. He's been drinking again. I didn't know he was outside." She looked genuinely horrified, glancing between me and him. "Go on, get home, sweetheart. You're all right now." Her son mumbled again, something about stolen tools and damn kids, but she snapped at him to be quiet. He swayed slightly, glaring at the ground. I didn't wait to hear more. My legs were already moving, carrying me toward the sidewalk as fast as they could go. By the time I got home, my lungs burned from running. I burst through the front door, slamming it behind me. My parents were in the living room, and the second they saw my face, my mom was up from the couch. I told them everything in one long rush. How we cut through the yard, the man yelling, grabbing me, the old woman stepping in. My dad's jaw clenched so tight I could see the muscles twitch. "That's it," he said, standing abruptly. "I'm calling the police." My mom put a hand on his arm. "Wait. Maybe we should talk to them first. It sounds like he was drunk and confused." The woman tried to help. My dad shook his head but didn't pick up the phone. "I'm still going over there tomorrow. He needs to know you don't lay a finger on someone else's kid." The next morning, my dad left right after breakfast and walked down the street. I waited by the window, the knot in my stomach tightening when I saw him knock on the door. The older woman answered, stepping aside to let him in. A minute later, the man came to the doorway. His posture was stiff, and his eyes were clearer than they'd been the night before. I couldn't hear everything, but my dad's voice was firm. The man didn't try to argue. He just kept nodding, looking embarrassed. He ran a hand through his hair and said something, then glanced toward the ground. When my dad came home, he told me the man had apologized. "He says he's been drinking too much lately," my dad said, still frowning. "Someone stole from his shed, and he thought it was kids. He admits he was way out of line. I told him that if it ever happens again, police will be the next ones knocking on his door." 3 days later, the situation got even stranger. My mom came home from talking with one of our other neighbors and told us that the missing tools had turned up in that neighbor's garage. Apparently, he'd borrowed them weeks earlier and forgot to bring them back. When he found them tucked behind some boxes, he walked them over to return them. The drunk man's accusations had been built on nothing but a bad assumption and too much alcohol. It made the whole thing feel even more ridiculous, though the memory of his grip on my arm still sat heavy in my mind. I told my friends what had happened, and they admitted they felt bad for running off. One of them said he'd thought about coming back, but he was too scared the guy might grab him too. I understood. None of us were used to seeing grown-ups lose control like that. After that night, I stopped taking shortcuts through anyone's yard. Even if a place looked abandoned, I stayed on the sidewalk or took the long way. I kept replaying the moment when the door slammed open, how fast things had gone from normal to dangerous. It was the first time I realized that adults could be unpredictable, that someone could seem harmless one moment and turn threatening the next. Sometimes when I'd pass that house, I'd catch a glimpse of the older woman on the porch, watering plants or sweeping. She'd look up and give me a small, apologetic smile. I'd nod back, but never stop to talk. I didn't see her son much after that. Maybe he stayed inside. Or maybe she kept a closer eye on him. But the image of him charging out of the house, yelling about thieves, stayed with me for years. It wasn't just the fear of that night that stuck. It was the understanding that people's judgment can vanish when they're drunk or angry. That even a stranger in your neighborhood can turn into a threat if the wrong assumptions mix with the wrong mood. And once you've seen that up close, you don't forget it. Last year, I was accompanying my mother to her cardiology appointment at St. Mary's Medical Center outside Atlanta. We got there about 20 minutes early, so we checked in and sat in the waiting area near the windows. It was one of those hospital lobbies with padded chairs lined up in rows, a coffee table stacked with old magazines, and the faint hum of the reception desk printers. My mother picked a chair that gave her a clear view of the television mounted in the corner, and I sat next to her with a travel magazine I pulled from the table. The room was quiet, except for the low chatter from the staff at the desk. A few other patients were spread around, most of them staring at their phones or flipping through paperwork. About 10 minutes after we sat down, the front doors opened and a man in his 40s came in with an elderly woman who looked like she might be his mother. She moved slowly toward the desk, leaning on her cane, and began speaking with the receptionist about forms. He stayed back a few steps, scanning the room before choosing a seat directly across from me. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I kept my eyes on the magazine, flipping past ads for cruises and photos of tropical beaches. But after a minute or two, I felt that instinctive prickle that comes when someone is watching you. I glanced up quickly. His eyes were on me. They slid from my face down to my torso and lingered there, and when I looked away, I could still feel the weight of his stare. I shifted in my chair, opened the magazine wider, and tried to block him from my peripheral vision. My mother was absorbed in the television, unaware. A few minutes later, I risked another glance. He wasn't even pretending to look elsewhere. His gaze tracked me, pausing on my hands, my lap, then back to my face. I focused hard on the words in front of me, flipping pages faster than I was actually reading them. The sound of my mother's name being called never came, and the minutes stretched. His mother was still at the desk, now signing something on a clipboard. He leaned back in his chair, one ankle resting on his knee, and his head tilted slightly as though studying me. My stomach tightened. I shifted again, crossing my legs and angling my body toward my mother. That didn't seem to discourage him. I kept my eyes down, turning the page without seeing it, the glossy paper catching the light. Every small noise in the room, the clack of the receptionist's keyboard, the cough of an older man in the corner, seemed louder against the tension building between us. I pressed my shoulder lightly against my mother's, hoping she'd sense it and glance at me, but she didn't. The man's expression didn't change. His stare was steady, unblinking, like I was part of a puzzle he was trying to solve. The staring didn't stop. More than 20 minutes had passed since he sat down, and each time I looked up, I caught his eyes still on me. His mother had finished her paperwork long ago and was now seated a few chairs away, flipping through a folded newspaper. Even the nurse at the desk noticed. She looked in our direction twice, her brow tightening slightly before she returned to her computer. That small reaction told me I wasn't imagining it. I slid my chair closer to my mother, closing the gap between us. The man didn't look away. If anything, he leaned forward slightly, his focus sharper. The shift made my pulse quicken. Other patients were starting to glance back and forth between us, their expressions awkward, like they were picking up on the uncomfortable undercurrent. I thought about asking the receptionist if there was another seating area we could wait in, but the idea of getting up and walking past him made my skin crawl. My mother finally looked over at me, puzzled, and I gave a small shake of my head. I didn't want to cause a scene, but his gaze felt like it was locking me in place. The hum of quiet conversation had faded. Even without words, his behavior was making the whole waiting room uneasy. When I needed to use the restroom, I kept my eyes on my lap for several minutes, debating whether I could wait until we got home. The discomfort in my stomach told me I couldn't. The problem was the hallway. It ran straight past where he was sitting. I tried to time it so I'd get up while he was looking away, but he never seemed to look anywhere else. Eventually, I took a slow breath, stood, and walked toward the sign pointing to the women's bathroom. I could feel his gaze on my back the whole way. I pushed open the bathroom door and let it close behind me. I'd just stepped toward the sinks when I heard footsteps in the hallway, quicker than a walk, but not quite a run. The door opened again. He stepped inside, filling the doorway, his hand resting on the edge so it couldn't swing shut. He looked around briefly, then locked his eyes on me. "I just wanted to get to know you," he said, taking a step forward. I moved back until I felt the tiled wall against my shoulders. "You need to leave right now," I told him, keeping my voice firm. He smiled faintly, as if I'd made a joke. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just thought we could talk." The smell of the hospital disinfectant mixed with the faint scent of his cologne, heavy and out of place in the sterile room. I stepped sideways toward the stalls, but he mirrored the movement, narrowing the space between us. My chest tightened, and my hands curled into fists. "I said leave," I repeated, louder this time. He took another step forward, closing the gap so much that I could see the small scuffs on the toes of his shoes. My exit was cut off, and the awareness of the solid wall at my back made the room feel smaller than it was. His presence there, in the women's bathroom, in a place where I had no easy way out, pressed down on me like a weight. I felt a surge of adrenaline and pushed my voice to its limit. "Get out!" I shouted, the sound bouncing off the tiled walls. Then I screamed, loud and sharp, pouring every ounce of fear into the sound. His face changed. Gone was the faint smile, replaced by a startled, uncertain look. For a split second he froze, then turned sharply and slipped out the door without another word. The door swung closed behind him, and the footsteps faded down the hall. I stayed where I was for several minutes, gripping the edge of the counter, my pulse hammering in my ears. My reflection in the mirror looked pale and tense. When I finally stepped back into the hallway, I checked in both directions before heading toward the waiting area. My mother looked up immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. I told her in a low voice, and her expression went from confusion to shock to anger in seconds. "He followed you in there?" she said, glancing over my shoulder. I nodded. "He cornered me." She turned her head just enough to look toward where he was still sitting with his elderly companion. He didn't acknowledge us, just sat in his chair as if nothing had happened, flipping through a folded pamphlet. We stayed together after that. My mother gripped her purse tightly, her eyes flicking between the clock and the hallway. Time passed slowly. About an hour later, I felt the same discomfort in my stomach again. I hated the idea of going back down that hall, but I didn't want to stay in my seat, tense and uncomfortable. "I'll come with you," my mother offered. We walked toward the restroom together. I was almost at the door when I caught sight of him rising from his chair. He wasn't looking at his companion, who remained seated. His eyes were on me again. He started walking in our direction. Before I could react, one of the nurses, who had just stepped out from behind the reception desk, noticed him. She paused, her gaze flicking between us. I could tell from her face she'd made the connection. When he kept moving, she set down her clipboard and stepped forward. "Sir, where are you going?" she asked firmly. He stopped just outside the doorway to the women's bathroom, glancing at her with a blank expression. "Please wait where you are," she said, then turned her head and called toward the reception desk. Security to the main waiting area. 2 security officers arrived within a minute. The nurse gestured toward him and quietly explained. The officers listened, then one addressed him directly. "You need to leave the premises now," he said. The man muttered something under his breath and looked back at his elderly companion. She stood slowly, gathering her purse. Together they walked toward the entrance, one security officer following close behind. The nurse returned to me. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that," she said. "You can use the employee restroom for the rest of your visit. It's just down the hall behind the desk. It's locked, and only staff have keys." I thanked her. My mother's appointment went ahead without any delays after that, but my shoulders stayed tight until we left the building. Even then, I kept looking behind us as we crossed the parking lot. Before we left, the nurse gave me a short form to fill out for the hospital administration. It asked for the date, time, and a brief description of the incident. "This will go on record," she said. "We take things like this very seriously. You did the right thing by speaking up." I filled it out carefully, making sure to note both times he'd followed me and the details of what had happened in the restroom. The nurse took the paper, assured me that the administration would review it, and said they would follow up if necessary. On the drive home, my mother shook her head. "In a hospital," she said, her voice still edged with disbelief. "You're supposed to feel safe here." I thought about the man's calm, deliberate movements, the way he'd acted like it was nothing, and the fact that it had taken 2 separate incidents for him to be removed. Even with the nurse's assurance, it sat heavy in my mind. A medical center should be the last place where you have to watch your back. But that day proved it wasn't immune to the same dangers as anywhere else. When I was 16, Ethan moved to our small-town high school from another state. From the first week, he stood out. He dressed in all black, sketched dark, intricate drawings during class, and talked about obscure bands and movies that I had never heard of. Most kids kept their distance, but I ended up sitting next to him in English. He noticed the patch on my backpack from a band only a handful of people around here knew, and that's how we started talking. Within days, we were swapping CDs and burned DVDs, texting late into the night about music and movies that no one else in our school cared about. He showed me albums from bands I'd never come across, foreign horror films with grainy subtitles, and comic books so strange and dark that I hid them from my parents. I'd always been quiet and kept to myself, but with Ethan, it felt like I'd finally met someone who got it. At lunch, we'd sit at the far end of the cafeteria, away from everyone else, sketching in his notebooks or making lists of movies to watch. He was into photography, but not the kind people posted online. He'd take close-ups of rusted metal, empty lots, broken glass. His short stories were always about the collapse of something: towns, families, people. The more I learned about him, the more I thought maybe he was just smarter and more creative than everyone else here. After a month, he started inviting me over after school. His room was crammed with stacks of books, photos taped to the walls, and old cameras on his desk. He showed me folders full of unfinished stories and sketchbooks thick with black ink drawings. He didn't talk much about his life before moving here, just that his old school was worse than this one, and that people there couldn't handle him. I didn't push for details. He could be funny, in his own sarcastic way, but most of the time he kept the conversations focused on music, movies, and art. It wasn't like hanging out with anyone else in town. No football games, no talking about who was dating who. Just long hours of sharing weird creative stuff. At that point, nothing seemed off about it. Then Ethan started asking me to skip classes with him. At first, it was just walking to the gas station during study hall, then coming back before anyone noticed. But after a while, he wanted to go further, into old buildings on the edge of town. He'd bring his camera, saying he was working on an art project about urban decay. We'd climb into abandoned warehouses, empty houses with peeling wallpaper, even a boarded-up motel. He'd take dozens of pictures of collapsed ceilings, graffiti, and scattered trash, then sit in silence for minutes like he was memorizing the place. He had a way of making it sound like we were doing something important, like documenting the parts of town everyone wanted to forget. I went along with it, even when we had to hide from passing cars or walk back through the woods to avoid being seen. Around that same time, Ethan got alcohol from somewhere. Cheap whiskey, beer in dented cans. We'd drink it sitting in parking lots or in those same empty buildings. He laughed when I choked on my first sip, then passed me the bottle again until it didn't burn as much. It didn't stop there. One day, he showed me a little bag of pills and said we could take the edge off. I didn't know exactly what they were, but I trusted him enough to try. It made everything slow down, like I was watching the day through a thick pane of glass. At first, it felt like just another part of the rebellion, something other kids probably did too. But Ethan's focus started changing. His camera roll wasn't just peeling paint and broken windows anymore. I saw pictures of wrecked cars from the highway, close-ups of smashed windshields with dried blood, even one of a shoe lying in the gravel beside a crash barrier. He told me he'd been going out at night to take them. He started talking differently too. Less about music and films, more about how pointless life was. He'd go on for minutes about how everything people cared about, school, jobs, families, meant nothing in the end. Sometimes he'd describe the details of violent news stories, lingering on them like he was trying to make me see what he saw. When I asked why he was taking so many accident scene photos, he just said, "It's real. People don't want to look at real things." Then he'd change the subject. The days we skipped school got longer. We weren't just hanging out in abandoned places anymore. We'd be walking along the railroad tracks, sitting in the middle of empty overpasses, or parked by the side of the road in his beat-up car, not talking much at all. He kept bringing up the idea that there was no point to anything, and sometimes it seemed like he was testing how far I'd agree with him. The more time I spent around him, the more it felt like the version of Ethan I'd met in English class, the one who was into music and art, was getting replaced by someone who only saw darkness in everything. The first time Ethan mentioned driving to another state in the middle of the night, it was just after midnight on a Friday. He texted me, saying he'd be outside in 10 minutes and that I should bring cash and anything sharp. I asked where we were going, and he just replied, "You'll see when we get there." When I told him I couldn't, he called me 3 times in a row. I didn't answer. The next Monday at school, he cornered me by my locker and said I was turning into everyone else, that I was boring now. After that, he started pushing harder. He'd suggest skipping school not just for abandoned buildings, but to follow strangers around the mall to see where they lived. Once, while sitting in his car behind the grocery store, he pulled out a folded-up map with highways and rural backroads marked in red ink. I asked what it was for, and he grinned without answering. His conversation started leaning toward biology. At first, it was about animals, saying he might want to be a vet one day. But his questions didn't sound like someone who wanted to help animals. He asked how small animals reacted when injured, if they fought or froze. He talked about pressure points in mammals, and how it doesn't take much to stop a heart if you know what you're doing. I'd laugh it off or change the subject, but the more he talked, the less it felt like a joke. When he realized I was dodging his texts and turning down plans, he got sharper with me. One day, walking out to the parking lot after school, he said, "You're acting fake. You're not scared of me. You're just scared of being interesting." I didn't reply. I just got in my car and left. Weeks later, I went to his house after he told me he'd found something I needed to see. We went down to his basement, and the smell hit me before I saw anything. Against one wall were folding tables covered with newspaper. On them were the bodies of animals, cats, raccoons, a small dog, lined up in strange, deliberate poses. Some were missing fur in patches. Others had cuts that didn't look like they came from any accident. He said they were roadkill he'd collected for study. He picked up a raccoon's paw, moving it like he was demonstrating something. The way he handled them wasn't clinical. It was slow, almost careful, like he was admiring the damage. He pointed out organs, explaining what each one did, his hands slick with blood. I told him it wasn't right, that this wasn't normal. He stopped talking and stared at me. "You don't get it," he said flatly. "You can't just look away from what's real. You're too soft." I told him I was leaving. He followed me up the stairs, saying I was overreacting, that I was throwing away the only friendship that mattered. I didn't turn around. That night, I deleted his number from my phone. After that, the messages started. First, just call me. Then longer ones accusing me of betraying him. He'd comment on posts I made, saying I was lying to myself and that I'd regret shutting him out. I blocked him on everything, but he found ways around it, asking people we both knew to tell me he just wanted to talk. I ignored every attempt. By spring, I hardly thought about him anymore. Then someone mentioned in class that Ethan wasn't coming back to school. His parents had pulled him out, and he was being taught at home because of some incidents. No one knew the details, but the way people said it, everyone understood it wasn't something small. Hearing that didn't make me feel relieved, just cold. I thought about the basement, the way he'd looked at me when I told him it was wrong. I wondered what he was doing now, and if his parents had any idea what he'd been capable of. I never saw him again. But sometimes, if I'm driving late at night and I pass an empty road or a dead animal on the shoulder, I think about his map with the red lines and the way he'd said I was too soft. I know I made the right choice cutting him off. I just wish I'd done it sooner.